Sound check. I'll come back again. Thank you.
Can you hear me now? Fabulous. So it's a good job I didn't do my apology. I will apologize for my pronunciation of some words in the introduction. I have only just been given it. And I will apologize because I'm doing this introduction. And obviously the topic that you're going to talk about in the book talks an awful lot about my people and what happened. So for that, I apologize. Let's get on with it. Right, this session shall be a discussion by His Excellency Navdeep Suri, moderated by Shahjahan. Is that okay? By Shahjahan, a media advisor for the National Media Council, on his latest book, Vaisakhi. How was that? That was okay? I'm doing all right so far then. Good. A renowned Indian music artist, Harpreet, you just heard, shall also perform live composition, one of the poems from the book. The original poem was written in the Punjabi language by the author's grandfather. So it's not just some words that you're hearing, it's some family heritage that's going on here. Nanak Singh was an eminent writer who's considered the father of the Punjabi literature. Now that's something I've learned today. The poem has been translated for the first time into English and is the only survivor's account of the worst atrocity under the British Raj at Jallianwala Bagh. That was in April 1919 in Amritsar. The author shall discuss how the incident changed the course of India's freedom, the struggles, giving the context surrounding the incident. The author shall also discuss how the people of various faiths came together. That's very heartening, particularly in this day and age, when we could possibly learn some lessons from what's happened past. They came together to stand up to colonization and oppression in one of India's darkest moments. So I'm going to let everybody else onto the stage, and I hope you have a really enlightening session, and welcome your speakers.
Please join the audience.
कलगी वालड़े शहनशाह पिता मेरे चरना तेरियां ते नमस्कार सतगुरु करके मेहर इस डुबदी जांदी नूं तक्का मार के लाउणा पार सतगुरु दास्तान शहीदां दी लिखणे नूं दास आपदा होया तैयार सतगुरु तोड़ चाड़ना अपनी मेहर करके नानक सिंह करे पुकार सतगुरु Thank you.
Thank you so very much. Love you. It was great. And right at the beginning, may I request all of you to forget the fact that we are with the ambassador of India to the UAE. Because we had a program at New York University last week, and I saw a news report in which something that he said in the discussion was attributed to his official ambassadorial position. So let's forget for the next 1 hour that he's the ambassador. We are with a writer, translator, literary aficionado, and inheritor of a great cultural legacy. So that's... Now, briefly, I would like to tell you my own impression about reading the book. This is a very multi-dimensional book. At one level, at the core of it, it's a piece of exquisite poetry. At another level, it's a historical document telling us the story of one of the most important events in India's freedom struggle. At another level, this is a book where we experience a proud grandson's efforts to keep alive the glorious legacy of his grandfather. It's also a deeply political, work of poetry where, we experience the nascent emotional upsurge of Indian, nationhood in the 1920s, which was actually one of the best periods in terms of Indians forgetting all their differences, coming together as one nation. And that feeling is also, we can find that throughout, Kooni, Vaisakhi, the sense of Indians uniting across religious, caste, linguistic divides. And also one more point I would like to make is the importance of translation. The tragedy of, we are a multilingual nation in India. The problem with us is, I come from the deep south, he comes from the deep north. I know much more about, say, perhaps I know all about some less known Irish writers or Australian writers or American writers, while I don't know anything about the most celebrated writer in my neighboring state of Tamil Nadu, Andhra Pradesh, Punjab, Himachal Pradesh, or other Indian states. So translation is the only way in which Indians can actually understand the legacy of our various components. In the 90s, there was a major project called Knit India Through Literature, as part of which a large number of works were published. So I would like to start with one question, which is very interesting, because all the discussions about the book, even the reviews centered upon the political, historical aspects of it. Of course, we would come to that. Could you share with us your impressions about Kooni Vaisakhi as a work of literature, as a piece of poetry? How did it communicate to you at a literary level?
Thanks, Shab. Let me first just say a couple of things. One, a warm welcome to the Australian ambassador, Arthur, who's himself a very accomplished translator and has translated from Greek into English. And just to draw attention to the little piece that Harpreet had sung, this is really from the first page of the poem, and it's like a prayer or an invocation, and the author is saying, oh, Guru of mine, give me the strength to perform this task. I'll just read out 4 lines which he sang so beautifully in Punjabi. To pen a portrait of those departed ones, grant me the strength, my divine Guru, to remind my people across India, lest we forget their sacrifice, my divine Guru. To write the saga of our heroes such, your disciple is ready, my divine Guru. Do help me complete this mission of mine. Nanak Singh beseeches, O my divine Guru. So it's really a prayer to the Guru to give him the strength to write a portrait that stands the test of time. And there's that, Shah and I were earlier discussing that there's this element that he was a 22-year-old, but he seemed to be writing for posterity. And there are other references to that similar thought in the poem, where he brings up this idea that future generations must remember. And the fact that this was written in early 1920, first published in May 1920, and today, 100 years later, we are talking about that in those terms. I think he kind of succeeded in his objective, despite the fact that the Brits had banned the book and confiscated it. Shah, on your other point about the poem as a piece of literature, I think that 2 or 3 things that stand out for me is, when you look at it in the context of our grandfather's background, you know, I've mentioned it somewhere in the book that we would often ask him, till what grade did you study? And he'd reply, well, you could say that I passed 4th grade, or you could say that I failed 5th grade. But I never went beyond that. And, you know, for him, as a relatively unlettered, self-taught 22-year-old, shuttling between Peshawar and Amritsar in those days, to find himself in the situation that he did, and then to express himself so evocatively. There are sections where there is raw passion. There are sections that are so vivid that you can almost see the scenes unfold before you. And, you know, for somebody who had been orphaned when he was 10 and, you know, didn't have any kids until this point of time, the way he writes about the sorrow of mothers who are grieving for their kids is really powerful. So clearly, you know, as literature, you see him as a person who could put himself in those situations. And I'll make one final point, which kind of is a post facto understanding of his work. So he wrote 2 or 3 pieces of poetry when he was in his late teens and early 20s, and then went on to become Punjabi's most famous novelist. What stood out as a novelist was that he was a natural storyteller. And his books were social dramas, but they were unbelievable page turners, and you meet millions of people who say that once you picked up his books, you couldn't put them down. And you see an early hint of that in this poem, where there's almost an instigation to the reader to turn the next page and discover what happened next. So I think you could see a bit of a premonition of Nanak Singh, the novelist, in this early ballad that he wrote.
I agree with you completely. I mean, I enjoyed the poetry, I mean, away from the history, politics, and personal aspects of it. And some of the parts of the work actually reminded me of, the grand compositions of Bulle Shah, the only Punjabi poet that I am actually familiar with, because I haven't read Punjabi poetry in translation much. Now, I think it's also important, particularly for those of you who are not familiar with the history of this whole work, for Mr. Suri to tell the story of the whole book. You know, this is the first and perhaps the only literary representation of the massacre in Jallianwala Bagh by a survivor of the massacre. It has been, perhaps Jallianwala Bagh is perhaps the most written about incident in our freedom struggle. From Sadat Hasan Mando to Sarojini Naidu, from Ballatol to, many Indian writers in different languages wrote, mostly poems more than fictions, but I'm sure there are hundreds of poems written by different, in different Indian languages on the incident, but this is the only one written by a survivor of the incident. And as such, it's very, very important historically. Now, the book gets published in May 1920. The British government bans the book, confiscates the available copies. Then nothing is known about the book for about 60 years. After 60 long years, the book is rediscovered. And now it is having an afterlife, which is quite dramatic in a way. So if you could just shed some light on that entire history, that would be nice.
Well, I've spoken on this earlier, that it was both a combination of serendipity and the sheer perseverance or will of my father to somehow locate this lost work. And we were just lucky that, my dad came across this article in a literary magazine in Punjab back in late 79, where a guy who's a professor of Punjabi literature, language, he had written this article talking about Nanak Singh the poet and quoting extensively from Kooni Vaisakhi. And that caught my father's attention, saying, how does this man know so much about Kooni Vaisakhi? Because nobody in the family had ever seen this since it was banned. And so he called up the editor of the magazine and said, I want to contact the author of this article. And so he got the address, and my mother and my father both went to this guy's home and asked him, how is it that you've written this story with Kooni Vaisakhi? And he said, well, my grandfather used to be an avid collector of books and pamphlets, and he would go to these fairs and bookstores and buy whatever he could. And everything was lying in 2 or 3 gunny sacks. And when they moved house from the old city to the new place, he was going through the stuff that his grandfather had left behind. And lo and behold, he stumbles on this pamphlet which was published in 1920. And immediately, being a man of literature, recognizes that this is something historic and proceeds to write the essay that he did. So pure coincidence at a certain level. But here's the interesting thing. So my father first republished this. My father's a publisher in Punjabi, and he first republished this in 1980. And it drew no attention at all in 1980. So it remained published but obscure, simply because in the larger body of my grandfather's works and all the novels that are prescribed reading if you are studying Punjabi literature and so on, this was seen as relatively insignificant. And I think the fact that we were coming upon the centenary and I had the opportunity to translate it, I think has really given it a new lease of life.
You mentioned the word serendipity. Actually, there is a book by the Italian novelist and philosopher Umberto Eco titled Serendipities. The basic argument in the book is that all the great things in human history happened by serendipity. So this is one of those, you know. So now, moving on, you know, from the history of the book, I was fascinated by the multiple references or the description of India's syncretic composite culture throughout, you know, the Kooni Vaisakhi. And it's beautiful invocation of what in the north we call the Ganga Jamuna Tahzeeb, you know, that kind of stuff. I mean, some of the lines are so fresh and it communicates to the reader in today's India. Look at this. Hindus and Muslims, they gathered together. It's about a Ram Navami festival, Hindus and Muslims celebrating together. A festival of Hindus, though it was Muslims who made it just their own, my friends. Or their friendship displayed a bond so strong, Hindu-Muslim were the same, oh my friends. Or, even more important and more interesting, Ya Hussein, cried out the Hindus and Sikhs. Ya Hussein cried out the Hindus and the Sikhs. As Muslims echoed, Ram, Ram, my friends. It's beautiful. So I think it would be good, you know, if you can shed some light on the kind of how these feelings, because as we were discussing, I mean, Punjab never had any kind of communal, you know, riot or communal issues before 1946, perhaps. So in 1920s itself, he was focusing so much on this aspect of communal harmony and amity.
I think there are references elsewhere in the poem about the British policy of divide and rule, which was clearly visible to people like my grandfather, even at that point of time. And you know, the passage that you cited from, I just want to read that 4 or 5 lines. This is a scene from a funeral procession in Amritsar. This is about 4 days before the massacre happened. There was already a smaller protest, and the British had fired upon a group of protesters. And the next day, they are taking the bodies to the burial grounds and the crematorium. So it says, Hindu, Sikh, and Muslim strode side by side, hearts pierced by arrows sharp, my friends. The same grief and pain they shared, each bound by sorrow, same, my friends. Then a sight most wondrous was seen. It left us amazed and awed, my friends. Ya Hussein, cried out the Hindus and Sikhs, as Muslims echoed, Ram Ram, my friends. And thus they reached the graveyard together, Hindu-Muslim and also the Sikh, my friends. Funeral pyres flamed for Hindus and Sikhs, with Muslims buried alongside, my friends. And I think the reason why Shah brings out this point is it's in the context of what we subsequently remember of the partition, it's kind of counterintuitive. Most records indicate that there were no communal riots between the Hindu-Sikh communities on one side and the Muslim community on the other side in undivided Punjab until 1946. And this is despite the provocations of separate electorates for the different communities and other efforts that were aimed at giving a separate identity politically to the different groups. The partition, the bulk of the impetus for the partition really came from the elite Muslim communities in UP and Bihar, in Allahabad, Lucknow, and elsewhere, who perhaps felt that the preeminence that they had enjoyed in their respective areas would be lost in a in an independent and secular India. So I think that's something worth remembering, because most of us remember the horrors of partition, and my grandfather wrote 4 major novels about the trauma of partition, and kind of assume that there was always enmity between the communities, which was certainly not the case in Punjab itself.
Now, another interesting aspect of the book is the presence of Justin Rowlett with very, very interesting, moving essay. Now, the contrast is, here is one grandson, exuberant and proud about his late grandfather, and here is another man, deeply ashamed about his great-grandfather. He comes to India as BBC South Asia correspondent. He was worried that people might not like him, people might be angry with him, because he is the great-grandson of a man hated by Indians at one point in time. Now here Justin writes a very evocative piece describing his arrival in India, his first visit to Jallianwala Bagh, interaction with the guy who was taking care of Jallianwala Bagh. He weeps towards the end of the visit. He's very emotional. And he repeatedly says in the essay that I feel very ashamed of the fact that my great-grandfather wrote this highly repressive and draconian law, the protest against which actually resulted in the massacre in Jallianwala Bagh. So, but at the same time, it is not bitterness that we feel when these two grandsons interact each other through the book. It is almost a kind of Gandhian grace that you feel in your own description of it at the beginning of the book, and then Justin's description of his own emotional and real experience with India and with Jallianwala Bagh. So if you could speak a bit about your decision to bring Justin in. And
again, I think it's a bit of good fortune or coincidence, whatever you call it. Firstly, we don't choose our grandfathers. We don't choose our grandfathers. So we shouldn't be held accountable for them one way or the other. But I think on a more serious note, so when I was doing research for the longish essay that I wrote for the poem, I wanted to know more about Sir Sidney Rowlett as the person who wrote what Gandhi called the Black Act, and otherwise known as the Rowlett Act. And so I kind of stumbled upon Justin as the BBC correspondent, and he'd written a small piece on Jallianwala Bagh when he'd first reached India as the BBC South Asia correspondent. I got hold of his contact details, spoke with him, explained my project to him, and said, would you write something? And he said, yeah, sure. And we agreed on the timelines and so on. But here's an interesting thing which I'll share. The first draft that he sent me is actually longer than the final version. And the portion that he eventually left out of the final version related to his uncle Arthur, who was the repository of family history and memories and memorabilia and all of that. And Uncle Arthur had seen the piece that Justin had written for the BBC website for India at 70 when he visited Jallianwala Bagh. And he said he had been roundly berated by his uncle for having the temerity to write something that puts the family in ill repute. And not only that, but saying that the guys that you are trying to defend, don't you understand? These people in Jallianwala Bagh were no different from the Al-Qaeda and ISIS of today. And so there was this shock and awe on Justin's face that he had an unreconstructed colonialist in his own family, even in the 21st century. But I think to maintain family harmony, he chose to drop that out. But that just tells you that those instincts of why Dyer did what he did, why Rowlett wrote what he wrote, why Michael O'Dwyer imposed the martial law and the punishments that were collective punishments that were imposed on the people of Punjab. I guess they're all matters of history now.
Now that reminds me, I was not planning to mention this. The two people experiencing Jallianwala Bagh massacre, responding to it in fundamentally different ways. Udham Singh, perhaps he was also very young at that time. He survived the massacre, and 20 or 21 years later, he kept the bitterness in his heart, and when he found the first opportunity, he assassinated General O'Dwyer. And here is another man. Michael O'Dwyer. And here is another man who also went through the same experience, but responded to it in a totally different manner. So could you, I think you mentioned somewhere in the book about this.
So I do make a mention of that Udham Singh, and in fact there's a wonderful book that another BBC journalist has just written called The Patient Assassin, which has come out a couple of weeks back, and that's by Anita Anand. And that's on Udham Singh, and he was merely 16 or 17 years old, and he was actually brought in to serve water to the people who had gathered to protest against the Rowlatt Act. And he was so impacted by the scenes that he saw that he swore revenge, and then pretty much spent 20 years waiting for the right opportunity that would, via East Africa and other places, take him eventually to London and put him in Caxton Hall in London, face to face with Lieutenant Governor Michael O'Dwyer, by then Sir Michael O'Dwyer, and shoot him and surrender his gun, and refuse to take a lawyer, and then make a very impassioned statement of why he did what he did. My grandfather, again, same place, same time, chose the power of the pen to express himself as he did. But I'm mindful of the time, and what I want to try and do, really, if you agree, is we have a wonderful composition from Harpreet coming up. I just wanted to give you a little context of that. There's this couple of very vivid passages in the book, in the poem, of when the firing happens and the aftermath of the firing. I'll just read a little bit and then ask Harpreet to come over. But what he has done very cleverly is he doesn't take the whole poem, because that would make it too long. So he takes excerpts from different sections. But it's titled The Gathering in Jallianwala Bagh. As the clock struck 5 on 13th April, they all gather in the Bagh, my friends. No, sorry, this is not it's the next one, sorry. This is General Dyer arrives and gunfire begins. 5:30 sharp, the clock had struck. Thousands gathered in the Bagh, my friends. Leaders came to lament the nation's woes, taking turns to speak out loud, my friends. Voiced grievance, hardship, anger, sorrow, saying no one listens to us, my friends. What can we do? What options left? Can't see any ray of light, my friends. Those words forlorn they barely voiced. Came soldiers thundering down, my friends. At Dyer's command, those Gorkha troops gathered in a formation tight, my friends. Under the tyrant's orders, they opened fire straight into innocent hearts, my friends. And fire and fire and fire they did. Some thousands of bullets were shot, my friends. And then I'm skipping a section and moving on to the next one. That narrow lane to enter the Bagh, sealed off on Dyer's command, my friends. No exit, no escape, no way out was left, making the Bagh a deathly trap, my friends. A fortunate few somehow survived, while most died then and there, my friends. Some ran with bullets ripping their chests, stumbling to their painful end, my friends. Others caught the bullet, running away, dropping lifeless in awkward heaps, my friends. And here's his section. In minutes, the bog so strewn with corpses, none knew just who was who, my friends. Many of them did look like Sikhs. Amid Hindus and Muslims, plenty, my friends. In the prime of their youth, our brave hearts lay, gasping for one last breath, my friends. Long hair lay matted in blood and grime. In slumber deep, they sleep, my friends. Says Nanak Singh, who knows their state, but God, the one and only, my friends.
Harpreet, please.
Hello, hello. Thank you so much for giving that reference. Thank you.
ठीक वक्त 5:30 ਵਜੇ ਦਾ ਸੀ ਲੋਕ ਜਮਾ ਹੋਏ ਕਈ ਹਜ਼ਾਰ ਪਿਆਰੇ ਕਹਿੰਦੇ ਜੂਣਾ ਆਸਾਂ ਦਾ ਹੋਇਆ ਔਖਾ ਕਿੱਥੇ ਜਾਇ ਕੇ ਕਰੀਏ ਪੁਕਾਰ ਪਿਆਰੇ ਅਜੇ ਲਫ਼ਜ਼ ਤਦਬੀਰ ਮੂੰਹ ਵਿੱਚ ਹੈ ਸੀ ਉਧਰ ਫੌਜ ਨੇ ਧੂੜ ਤੁਮਾ ਦਿੱਤੀ ਥੋੜੀ ਦੇਰ ਪਿੱਛੇ फौज गोरखे दी जनरल डायर ने अगा वधा दिती मिंटां विच ही कई हजार गोली मिंटां विच ही कई हजार गोली उन्हां ज़ालिमां खत्म करा दिती पल विच ही लोथां दे ढेर लग गए कोई सके न मूल पछाण उथे पल विच ही लोथां दे ढेर लग गए कोई सके न मूल पछाण उथे रोंदे पिटदे लोक संबंधियां नूं ढूंढण वास्ते मुर्दियां वल जांदे मापे वेख के अपने बच्चियां नूं हाय वांग पतंगे दे जल जांदे मापे वेख के अपने बच्चियां नूं है वांग पतंगे दे जल जांदे मोए लाडले जिन्हां दे पुत यारो मोए लाडले जिन्हां दे पुत यारो सीने नाल कटारिया सल जांदे पत्थर वांग जिन्हां दड़े दिल पत्थर पत्थर वांग जिन्हां दड़े दिल पत्थर ਨੀਰ ਉਹਨਾਂ ਦੀ ਅੱਖੀਓਂ ਚੱਲ ਜਾਂਦੇ मेरे लाल में वारियां जाग छेती मेरे लाल में वारियां जाग छेती जंगल विच आके कानू सोना सी बिना पुछिया लमड़े राह पियो सानू पुछ के विदा होना सी रताया सादा साथ उड़ीक लेंदो रताया सादा साथ उड़ीक लेंदो कड़ी दो कड़ी चाई खलो जेकर आ गया सी तेरा वक्त बचा जेकर आ गया सी तेरा वक्त बचा माई बाप नू अगे चा ढोवना सी नानक सिंह पर लिखे नू कौन मिटे नानक सिंह पर लिखे नू कौन मिटे ए हुक्म करतार दा होवना सी
Thank you.
Beautiful. Thank you. So we have a little bit of time for some interaction. How much time do we have? We started a bit late, so if you could tell me how.
We have another session at 4, but I think they're a little late. So shall we say 10 minutes?
10 minutes. So please be brief and to the point. Questions, comments.
I wanted to know how you can relate the book to the current generation. Because I don't think in my generation many people know about this.
So that's really partly the point of the book, that your generation should know, because if we forget our history and if we forget our past and if we lose our heritage, then we are collectively and individually poorer. And so the whole idea of trying to bring the translation into English is to make it accessible to those who can't read Gurmukhi. And so, as I mentioned earlier, that even when it was republished in Gurmukhi, not many people read it. But now the fact that it is in English, it's accessible to a much larger audience. The fact that even the Gurmukhi has been translated into Hindi or Devanagari does make it more accessible. Thank you.
I must add here, because when I read it 5 times. And I felt Nanak Singh was intimately and personally talking to me. I mean, I couldn't feel the difference of 100 years between us. Please.
Hi, thank you very much for today's presentation. It really is absolutely gorgeous to be here. I just wanted to ask a question about the translation. And I know that translation is obviously a great labor of love and a great privilege. Labor of love because you put so much time into someone else's work, and a privilege because you get through your pen a master's work. But translation is also a great act of violence, because you take something from one language and you have to break it open and make it live in another language. Sometimes you have to change the words, sometimes there's a phrase you can't translate perfectly, And I just wanted to know, what was your approach to that particular challenge and that great act of violence, especially when it's a work that is so close clearly to your heart?
Thanks for bringing it up, Arthur. I'd never translated poetry before. And so the first act for me was to educate myself on how to translate poetry. Are there best practices? Are there schools? Is there some guidance that I can follow? And in the early stages, the advice given to me was that because the original is in verse and with a certain rhyme and meter and a cadence about it, it's very difficult to both convey the meaning in the original and to preserve the cadence in the new. So I actually did an initial draft which was like free verse, because that's what some of the advice that was coming to me was. But at some point I read this beautiful book which talks about poetry and languages and translations and so on. And what clinched the deal for me was it has this remarkable chapter where he takes a novel of Pushkin's that's written entirely in verse, translated by 4 different accomplished translators, and he puts all 4 translations into 4 quadrants, like 4 windows, and says, okay, here's A, B, C, D, different countries, different points of time, same original. Which one do you like? And he gets a reader to make the choice. And you could see the differences that you're talking about. But one thing that stood out was all 4 had chosen to translate Pushkin into verse, from verse into verse. And that kind of, the message for me was, it would be unacceptable level of violence to lose the rhythm and cadence of the original. And so you really have to preserve a balance between the content and the form. And hopefully do justice to both, not protect the form and abandon the content, or protect the content and abandon the form. So my effort really has been to do minimum violence. There are areas where I was completely stuck for days, and I felt that this is untranslatable, I cannot do justice to it. And I just left it, and then came back to it like a week later, 10 days later, and suddenly things fell into place. So I guess also when you translate like this, where one page is in Hindi or Punjabi and the facing page is in English, you're opening yourself up to a much higher level of scrutiny, because everyone here who can read Hindi can pass judgment that I think you should have done it like this, or this doesn't work. But well, that's it.
Shukran jazilan. It is actually very interesting, but as a comparison between languages, and I am actually from that profession of translating, and it is extremely interesting, and I think both gentlemen here talked about something very, very important. Yourself, you don't translate the poetry because you think you lose something when you do it. And he's asking, how can we get into this poetry if we don't have translation? It is a dilemma. There are languages, from my own knowledge, you can translate poetry from French to German, for instance, because the basics in the poetry are similar. But I would never try to translate it into Arabic, or from Arabic to French, because it is impossible. The basics, or the canon of the poetry, is completely different, so you lose something always. And I think if it is possible, is to read it in its original if it is Arabic. But in the other languages, I guess that there are very, very good translators. I agree with you because I have the experience also to read a couple of things.
Thank you very much. You know, I would agree. I think this poem is easier to translate than some other works of poetry because it is like a narrative of events, except that it's in verse. So I guess it lends itself better to translation than some other pieces of poetry. There's a Punjabi poet called Shiv Batalvi, and his poetry is so rich in metaphor, that is so rooted in the soil, that to even attempt to translate would be to do unacceptable level of violence to it. So I guess this one worked a little bit better than some other poems might have because of the simplicity of the narrative in the original.
Any other question?
Good afternoon, sir. Just taking these two people's thought further. You're already quite proficient with English, Hindi, Punjabi, and Arabic. So, do we expect an Arabic version soon?
I hope there'll be an Arabic version, but not done by me. In fact, there was a suggestion from Kalima to translate, and I said I would first want to know who the translator is, and whether the translator would be willing to work closely with me so that we take it on as a combined sort of project. Otherwise, it may not work. So yeah, that's where we are currently.
Any other question? Then
I just wanted to say that should any of you have a burning desire, then there are some copies outside which I'll be happy to sign.
I think now, I think we're done. I think any other comment or question? So now let's restore Mr. Suri. Please, Mansoor.
Your Excellency, Navdeep Suri, Ambassador of India, we really, I had a close encounter to meet you and interview about this book. And it's what you have done is, or what you achieved in writing the book this way. I congratulate you personally, and I will have a copy of it signed.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
All right, now let's restore Mr. Suri to his ambassadorial incarnation. Thank you, Your Excellency. Thanks to everybody. It has been a nice session. I hope everybody enjoyed and benefited from it. Thanks.